Hi everyone, welcome to Globus Books virtual living room salon. We are about to start an extremely exciting for me and hopefully everybody else program with the best minds, I want to say, of the Slavic literary studies and poets and writers and readers, most importantly, joining us from all over the world. So this is going to be provocative. This is going to be interesting. This is going to be food for thought. We will start with a short introductory video that will give you an idea of what Globus does and what this show is intended to do.
Globus Books was established in 1971 and will be turning 50 this year. And it was founded and run by immigrants from the former Soviet Union. It specializes in Russia and former Soviet republics. Immigrant history, local history, Jewish culture, offers a unique section of LGBTQ and feminist Russian language authors in Russian and English, in addition to carrying a rare collection of anti-Soviet press and modern underground zines. Globus served several generations of immigrants. Under new management, Globus continues its tradition of giving voice to underrepresented communities. Today, we are launching on a task as vast as Russia itself. To define Russian literature is to define Russian identity. So good luck to us. Even arranging the bookshelves presents a challenge. Chances are we are not going to accomplish the task. We are just starting the conversation. There is a question upon question. First, how do we define Russian in Russian literature? Is it the literature of ethnic Russians, русская литература, national Russian literature, российская, Russophone, written in Russian language, русскоязычная, Soviet, советская, post-Soviet, постсоветская? Is it a category of language, geography, or history? Each of our speakers might have their own answer today. The imperial history and colonial ambitions are crucial for understanding Russian literature and identity. After the fall of Constantinople, Russia aspired to become the Third Rome. After the fall of the Russian Empire, from its ashes rose another empire, the Soviet Union. It fell too, but the myth of a big brother with its satellite countries continues to dominate politics, minds, and the literary process of the land today. Former Soviet republics turned to their linguistic and literary roots, but their Russian language literature continued to exist. Today, we are looking forward to hearing presentations on literatures of several sovereign countries that were a part of the empire in the Soviet Union: Kazakhstan, Ukraine, the countries of Caucasus, Lithuania. And then we have the mother of all questions. What is literature? For the purposes of today's talk, we dare define it as the reflection of a culture, of a collective psyche, a mirror image of the life of a country in time. If we look at Russian literature from this point of view, we can see that just like the nation itself, this literature is defined by a split. It is fragmented throughout history. East or West? We will leave this here. Then there is the language. In the 19th century, French became the first language for the educated, for the writers and readers of Russian literature, while serfs were illiterate. Literature was split in two, like Tolstoy's page in French, with Russian translation in subtitles. The Soviets obliterated illiteracy, but brought other splits. In the USSR, official and unofficial literatures existed parallel to each other. the banned underground literature found its way to the readers through samizdat, self-publishing, and tamizdat, their publishing, works smuggled and published in the West, such as Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago or Alexander Solzhenitsyn's work. There is a split in time. Authors who refused to comply with the socialist realism wrote into a drawer. Their works were published after the fall of the USSR. Mikhail Bulgakov was one of them. And then there was the Iron Curtain, and the emigre writers published in the West in Russian like Ivan Bunin or Sergei Dovlatov, and in English like Vladimir Nabokov or Joseph Brodsky. As the borders opened, a whopping number of former Soviet Union citizens immigrated and a new group emerged, global Russians. They created their own literary niche in the West and created the post-Soviet literature outside of Russia. There are Russian-born authors writing in English, French, German, Finnish. We are starting this conversation now.
My name is Irina Zabriskie, and I am a San Francisco-based author, and I just spoke about the great split of the Russian literature. My own split kind of mixes in it as well, because I'm here in at least 4 capacities, I think. First and foremost, I'm a Russian-born novelist who writes in English only, with 5 books published in the US and Canada, and not a word in Russian. Yet I am constantly being described or referred to as a Russian writer. So this is my confusion number 1. And I wonder if other people are experiencing that as well. So confusion number 2 is I'm a bookstore manager who needs to sort out our shelves, as you've seen in the video, in a clear and comprehensive manner. And that's a big challenge. Number 3, I'm a producer of this channel, and I'm very lucky and honored to interview a lot of authors from the former Soviet Union. So I have questions on how to do it right, in addition to just choosing the language. What are the right terms? What are the right words? And number 4, I'm also a journalist who writes about the current events, and I'm not going to go there right now, but I can assure you that the issues of identity are of paramount importance to that field as well. So I mostly want to hear what you have got to say, but I will also chime in with the following. My take, after a lot of thinking on the definition of the Russian literature, is, for me, Russian literature is certainly defined by the language, but not in a linguistic sense. Rather, it is the language of the shared history, or one might argue, one being me, is the language of trauma that defines the post-Soviet and post-Russian empire space. Because for me, the prevailing theme of suffering, this union, Soviet Union of trauma, that is what Russian is for me. And so the literary process is all about finding this language, and it's both extremely personal and also common, communal, for all those who emerged from this former Soviet Union, I believe, former Soviet Empire. Then there is this thing. In immigration, there is an added split to the great split of the Soviet existence. This is the splintered existence, расщепление, dual identity that all immigrants have, not just from the former Soviet Union. And then if the language is acquired, like mine, we live and create in some folds in the cracks of the language. And it might sound like a handicap, but I dare say, but it actually is an advantage. Because if you look at it from the point of view of Shklovsky's defamiliarization, making it strange, which is his main concept and main contribution to Russian formalist theory, прием отстранения. If you look at отстранение, the root in the word is страна, something to think about and talk about, a country. So you are getting distance from this country, alienation, right? So it's a tactic, as in Shklovsky work, the art as device, art as tactic. And there's a great book by Zinovy Zini called Immigration as Tactic, something to talk about maybe in the future. So our misunderstanding, our slowing down creates this unique angle. So all these displacements and digressions and casual disruptions are actually working for us. And lastly, changing countries is always changing the context. And you can do that, but you will always bring with you this emotional luggage in your suitcase. At least I know I do. And this suitcase is a prominent image, actually, and a symbol of the Russian literature, both at home and abroad, from Pelevin to Dovlatov, you name it. So there is this heaviness and the load of the Russian-born writers, no matter where they write. And we always drag it around or misdragging it around. And I want to see how we try to unpack this suitcase during this show. So let's see what you guys have to say about that. I'm really excited to hear.
Thank you for gathering us all here together. This is such an exciting conversation with so many exciting faces, people that I know and I've never met before. This event came out of an exchange that Zarina and I had, and it kind of snowballed up to its current scale. And because of the scale, I'm going to try and be extraordinarily brief, but I'll say just three things. I'll name three, maybe four viewpoints or perspectives on this problem. So number one would be to say that Russian literature has never been more fragmented as a concept than it is today, which is to say that 30 years ago, as we all know, the Soviet Union fell apart. Up until that time, the world of literature in Russian, let's call it, seemed to be structured by the divides between the socialist world and the non-socialist world into Russian literature proper or Soviet literature and emigre literature. And structured in such a way that those two parts didn't actually meet except through fairly highly structured exchanges, through tamizdat, samizdat kinds of clandestine passages through the borders of the Iron Curtain, but also through official passages through the Iron Curtain, sponsored by Progress and other Soviet publishers that were exporting Russian literature abroad. Since that time, as we all know, millions of Russian speakers and Russians have spread out across the globe. The Russian-speaking territories of the Soviet Union have broken into multiple different sovereign states, and the situation has snowballed into a globe which is fragmented into multiple different locations in which Russian literature is produced, consumed, and, as Zarina said, into multiple different languages in which people who identify themselves as Russian are producing something which has some relationship to Russian literature per se. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that Russian literature has never been more unified as a global space than it is today, which is to say that long gone are the highly structured separate categories of emigre and Russophone and Russian literature in the Soviet Union. The world is now, as we know, crisscrossed by container ships carrying Russian books in every different direction from every different location in which they are produced, and also joined together through the virtual networks that allow producers and consumers of literature to exchange books both legally and illegally. There has never been more connectivity across the locations in which Russian literature is produced and consumed in the world than there is now, today. The third thing I'll say is there have never been more categories of people producing and consuming Russian literature than there are today, which raises, I think, a whole another set of questions about who gets to decide what is Russian literature and what is a Russian author. Is this a question which relates to the language in which literature is produced? Perhaps not. Many people are identified as Russians, like Zarina, or maybe identify themselves as Russians, who write in other languages than Russian, but somehow within a Russian tradition. Does it relate to the location? Well, in a world in which 1 week someone can be classified as an extraterritorial Russian writer writing in a beached diaspora in Crimea, and the next week they can be classified as a Russian living within the Russian Federation as a result of the movements of armies. It's difficult to say that location has the same kind of ontologically obvious meaning that it once did, or if it ever did. Where does the territory of Russian literature, the proper territory of Russian literature, begin and end? Obviously, that question is a question which has been, as Irina mentioned, patrolled and prosecuted with armies through the course of history. On the other hand, should we say that it is the identity of the individual that gets to decide? Is being a Russian something that only the author can say for him or herself? We could also talk about the strange imbrications of location, movement, mobility, and exchange with examples like, let's take MICHAELI, American heritage author, started writing in English, emigrated from Soviet Riga as a teenager in the 1990s, wrote a novel and published it in New York, became a successful journalist in English, relocated to Moscow, became the lead editor of GQ Moscow, started writing in Russian, translated his own works and wrote some works in Russian, then became a film writer and director, relocated to Berlin, made a couple of movies in Russian from Berlin, and now he's living in Los Angeles. How do we identify a person like that? What do we do with someone like the American-born of Russian extraction poet Eugene Ostashevsky, who I think we'll be hearing from a little bit further on today, who also born in the Soviet Union, emigrated, started writing in English, but now writes in pretty much every language he knows, which is now several, as he has snowballed his own career around the world. I think he's currently located in Shanghai. So all of these questions, I think, are ones that we'll touch on today. I don't think we're going to close down any of these questions personally. I think probably we're just going to open them up. I'm really excited to hear what other people have to say about all of these issues.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, it's an honor to speak about Tamizdat virtually, albeit at a venue that, in fact, has so many of the physical Tamizdat copies of books, which used to be mere manuscripts and became books only upon crossing the border, which is the first thing that defines Tamizdat as I understand it, at least. It comprises texts that have to travel in order, on their way, let's say, from the drawer to the reader, have to travel at least in one direction, have to have at least an outbound itinerary, but because Tamizdat is not only a literary practice, but it was, I should say, is no longer, was also a political institution, it usually implied that the inbound itinerary would be reversed, and those same texts in a published form would be smuggled back to the other side of the curtain where they originally came from. So in my definition of Tamizdat, which I would like to propose and of course discuss during the Q&A part, it's a work in progress, this definition itself, but it does follow the geographical principle. In this sense, it is different from what's conventionally referred to as émigré literature, simply because, however we call it, it's different from literature produced and published in the same geographical and cultural and legal jurisdiction, if you'd like. So as far as because our topic is Russophone, not only Russian, but also Russophone, that's the second factor that makes me, in my case, deal with the Russian Tamizdat, is that these are texts originally written in the Russian language, which also makes it a bit easier because to reduce it to this linguistic principle, because the project is largely historical. Of course, Tamizdat has gone into history ever since the Iron Curtain rusted through and the Cold War ended, and was effectively replaced nearly simultaneously in the early 90s with the rise of the web and the internet, which makes Tamizdat obsolete, of course, not only politically, but perhaps more importantly, technologically. So what used to be quite an elaborate, typical Tamizdat operation involving so-called mules or smugglers, and not to mention all the consequences, etc., etc. This has been nearly overnight replaced by just a few clicks. And that's as much as it takes for a text to go live nowadays, of course, even though the political aspect of online publishing, this is not to say that it is in any way less precarious. Perhaps in the early 90s, the internet was, of course, conceived as the freedom of speech incarnate, if you'd like. Today, as Robert Darnton, for example, writes in his book Censors at Work, it's being fought, divided, and cyberspace warfare is, in a sense, also quite an ordeal, as we know, and even in the context of what Kevin was just talking about. I just wanted to shamelessly use this occasion and just point you to this online project. Ironically, we need internet and digital tools to conceptualize what used to be print. It's tamizdatproject.org. I will switch to the English version of the website. It is something that's, much as the definition of Tamizdat itself, it's something that is always going to be, I'm afraid, a work in progress, but nevertheless, it helps us see kind of the material aspect of Tamizdat, all those books that Zarina has on the shelves in the bookstore. Of course, not all of them, but some of them. You can see what accompanied the histories of their publications by authors, by, let's look at, for example, Chukovskaya, by first editions, as well as through the corpus of accompanying sources such as reviews, correspondence, archival predominantly, documents, diaries, paratexts, introductions, etc., etc. And thereby it is possible, because the project is ultimately historical and encompasses roughly 30 years or so, well, a bit more, allows us to reconstruct what it really was and kind of gain an insider perspective and see what, because it was all very pretty much clandestine, now it is kind of time to look back and see what it was, especially considering that roughly, perhaps it's at least 70% of all the books we teach in 20th century Russian Lit courses, and can so easily and freely just pick up on Amazon or from around the corner from a bookstore nowadays.
So my name is Catherine Young. I am a poet and translator based in the Washington, D.C. area. And I have been asked to talk about the tiny little subject of post-Soviet literature outside of Russia. I'm going to start, and I'm obviously not going to do it justice, but I want to start with a really basic question, a practical question, which is the center of the Russophone publishing world still Russia? Which leads me to a broader question. What is the medium of Russian literature or Russophone literature in a digital world? Is it still the printed page? And in a time when writers publish on social media, does it even really matter where the books are printed? And I also want to talk about a different kind of question, or at least raise a different question. To what extent do Russophone writers beyond Russia want to be identified as part of Russian lit? So I'm going to start with the former Soviet republics. So many questions, but I'll just start with one. To what extent is Russophone literature in the former republics post-colonial? And what do we mean by the term post-colonial in this context? And I'll start with a case study of Azerbaijan, where I've been working with 83-year-old writer Akram Aylisli, who was a grandee of Soviet literature, billions of books published in the Soviet Union. And he's always written originally in Azeri, but generally published in Russian. Now, in the early 2000s, when he couldn't publish his work in Azerbaijan, in independent Azerbaijan, for political reasons, he translated his own work into Russian and got it published in Russia. So Yasha, this is kind of like a reverse Tamizdat, right? He clearly considers his writing Azeri literature. I am not sure that he considers it Russian literature, even though he has many Russian influences and studied Lit in Moscow. And I'm pretty sure he would object to the term post-colonial as offensive to the rich tradition of Azeri literature that's also a huge part of his work. Then we can think about Ukraine, which is a very special case where many Russophone writers are using their first language, Russian, to write work on war in which the geopolitical Russia is, quote unquote, the enemy, right? Thinking of Lyudmila Khersonska, Iakhieva. Some of these writers, including Iakhieva, are actively working now to publish and write more in Ukrainian. So I'm hoping Tatiana, and we'll talk about that later on, in terms of what does it mean to be a Russophone writer in today's Ukraine. We have writers in exile by choice or by circumstance, Hamid Ismailov in the UK, Mikhail Shishkin in Switzerland, both of whom write in multiple languages. Is this Russian literature? We have writers in immigration, the whole, gamut of writers in immigration in America, Irina Mashinsky, Vladimir Druk. We have Svetlana Sachkova, who's currently studying for her MFA in Brooklyn, but she's got a new novel out in Moscow, which is getting some good press. So all this is clearly Russophone lit, but is it Russian lit? And now I don't really want to do this, but I have to ask a broader question about gender. And the reason I don't want to do this is because we are in the year 2021. But even so, if you attach the label woman's to something like Zhenskaya Poesia or whatever, it's immediately discounted by too many Russian powers that be, including publishers, editors, critics, and up until very recently, prize jurors. And I'm talking in Russia proper. So what implications does prejudice against women's writing, which is often genre writing, what implications does that prejudice have for Russophone women writing beyond Russia proper? And I also want to say a word about age and the younger generation of Russophone writers. If you have not yet seen the current edition of Words Without Borders, there's a terrific portfolio of young Russophone writing that was curated by Hila Cohen, who's joining us today, and also Josephine von Zitzowitz. And I'm also indebted to Hila Cohen for a presentation she made some time back in which she talked about the performative nature of a lot of Russian literature these days. Young or younger writers like Anna Starobinets, Arnarine Abgaryan, who pretty much chronicle their lives on social media. So you can tune into, for example, a Facebook page and find out about somebody's child who's had a concussion or a dog who's run away. And this is all part of their artistic persona. It's a way of presenting themselves in a non-textual way, but it's, it is still part of their writing art. A lot of these younger writers tend to be multicultural. Think of Alisa Ganayeva from Dagestan, or Abgaryan, who writes in Russian, but a lot of her work is about village life in Armenia. A lot of these writers are collaborative. They work on multiple platforms, social media, journalism, screenwriting. They're multilingual. And some of them, like the Russian-speaking polyglots, I'm thinking I've worked with Ksenia Emelianova or Iakhieva, they give you a text in Russian, you translate it into English, and they start working with the English translation. They make changes to the English, and by the time you're done, you have a poem in English and a poem in Russian they're not twins anymore. There's no sort of authoritative text in Russian. So how do we classify and work with these? So in this world of younger writers, physical geography in particular has, to me, little real meaning beyond personal circumstance.
I'm LIZA MICHAELI, and I'm a PhD student in rhetoric at UC Berkeley. If Israel is the area to which I've been assigned, and if the invitation is to define Russian literature and language in Israel, then I would suggest that the very word definition becomes vulnerable to scrutiny. Because Russian, as it exists as an idea in Israel, is very different from Russian as it functions as a living, breathing speech or even entity. In simple terms, the difficulty is such that Russian is the predominant, which is to say the most widely spoken, non-official language in Israel. But how do you define a language? Or how do you isolate the influence of something that predominates in the mouth, but ascends to semi-officiality only in some areas, and in principle enjoys an official designation in none? So it's worth lingering on this tension, which exists in the non-officially predominant or the predominantly non-official, on the ways in which something like Russian may be alive, which is to say felt or affectively obvious, but unacknowledged. Contagious in the way that it influences Hebrew, but undiagnosed, determining and predominating, but undefined, lingering, but unmetabolized, hidden in plain sight, or rather in every utterance. And, you know, I take this liberty with the supple but elusive impressions with the language, just to suggest the ways in which what is living is rarely aware of the ways in which it is alive and breathing in your speech. And I think that this consideration weighs heavily upon the way in which Russian is woven into the fabric as a bulging or a bloating of the official languages or language of Israel. So then the question, for me at least, becomes, does Israel as a society want to know about the Russian in its midst and in its Hebrew? Or is it even a question of knowledge and then of choice? So then the question has to be revised again, because if as I'm claiming, at least today, we cannot systematize the pursuit of this affective influence, because that's not the way absorption works, right? May we trace the ways in which the language pursues itself, or rather the ways in which the language may be self-officiating by its literal proliferation in our mouths. These things actually occur at the guttural level and on the lexical dimension, in the business of everyday life, in the synagogue, the bus, the cafe, on the street. And many of these tensions and these struggles escape definition. And so to recover the title of the event itself, and perhaps to revise its directionality, I can't say it's possible to render a definition upon a self-accumulating presence, upon something that insists upon its own aliveness in Israel, which is not to say that Russians and Russian did not have to labor hard and still do to survive in Israel. As someone who was born in Jerusalem and grew up speaking Russian but never formally learned Hebrew, and learned it myself later in my life, when I speak what is today called modern Hebrew, I can say unambiguously that each one of my utterances throbs with Russian. And that is not a definition I choose. That is something that predominates in me. And if this is not so much a way of addressing the title of the event and of rendering a definition or a category, then allow it at least to be an experiential attestation to the fact that this definition, this affective presence is very much felt.
I am Polina KOPYLOVA from Finland, based in Helsinki. I'm a poet and a translator, mainly between Russian and Finnish. And I was translating the modern Finnish poetry to Russian. And actually, it was a kind of a challenge to fit my thoughts into this short presentation. But what I would like to speak about is that actually Finland is a country which has a good reputation all over the world, but we rarely think about Finland as a place for Russian emigre literature, and there is a reason for that. Because if we look at the history of Russian immigration 100 years ago in 20s after the revolution, we can notice that Russians were not staying in Finland, but Russians were moving from Finland to Germany, to France, and to the Czech Republic, and wherever. And there are very special reasons for that. One of those is that Finland was a part of Russia for almost more than 100 years, up to the moment when it got the independence, almost a decision of Lenin, who didn't know what to do with it. So in Finland, there was special attitudes towards Russia and Russians, which were mainly formed during the reign of Nicholas II, who tried to so-called Russify Finland, to make Russian the main official language in Finland, which is generally bilingual, speaking Finnish and Swedish. So the attitudes towards former colonialist Russians in Finland 100 years ago were rather harsh. And many of those Russians who stayed in Finland and established their families in Finland and decided to integrate to Finland, integrated through Swedish-speaking community, and many people were even changing their names. So in 20s and 30s, there really wasn't much of literary life, and there are very few names which are known until now. I can name two of maybe most known poets on this emigre scene, which are Ivan Savin and Vera Bulic, and they were very classical Russian emigre poets in Finland, which were dealing with the topics, with the emotions, and with the whole way of thinking, which was very, very typical for Russian immigrants of that generation, that time. After that, in 40s, 50s, and 60s, there were almost nothing happening in Finland because there were no new immigration waves. And the next wave coming to Finland from Russia wasn't actually the immigration, but it was a repatriation of Inkeri Finns, the Finns which were located in Russia, which suffered a lot from Stalin's repressions, and they were granted by President Mauno Koivisto the right to return to Finland in 80s. So there were about 30,000 of these Finns coming to Finland that time, mostly desiring to arrange their lives normally and to live normally in better conditions than 90s Russia could offer them. They were called like sausage migration, kolbasная migrácia. So this community was not that much into culture. But the paradox of this community was that actually those people were very much of Russian mentality, much more of Russian mentality than of Finnish mentality. So in the beginning of the 20s, like 2000, in the beginning of 2000, in the beginning of millennium, they formed the community of authors writing in Russian, like Russophone writers, who generally reminded very much the traditional Russian emigre writers, and they were maintaining, I guess, consciously the same cultural traditions, and literary traditions, including this feeling of superiority, cultural superiority towards the Finnish literary scan, which was very weird because the Finnish literature is incredibly rich and interesting, and it is very much, let's say, endemic because the whole Finnish language and culture is kind of very much endemic within the frames of European culture. So if we speak of nowadays situation, I should say that despite we have now up to 90,000 Russian speakers in Finland, which forms the population of this middle-sized town, we actually only have this still existing this very traditional community of, let's say, emigre writers in there, which let's say they are acting on pretty amateur level, and they are addressing their own circles of audience, and they are not much and they're not very much they don't networking with the Finnish literature scan. And what comes to me, I'm a kind of a lonely standing figure, I guess. Well, not that lonely standing figure, but we are standing lonely together with my colleague, poet Hamdam Zakirov, also based in Helsinki, who is Uzbek Russian Finnish author, who was translated to Finnish a lot by Jukka Mallinen. So the problematics of Russian language going global and Russian literature going Russian writers going global and being much more than Russian, but still using Russian language for writing and for creative activity. This is not that much of the agenda of the Russian speakers cultural community in Finland, let's say. Still, it was a very nice new for us, for me and Hamdam, because we have got a grant to promote exactly this concept of Russian being bigger than Russia, Russian language being bigger than Russia, and we are going to organize a series of events this year, hopefully offline, but also online. And we are going to invite people writing in Russian, Russophone writers from other countries to participate in these events, because we would like also to introduce the idea of writing in Russian but being global to Finnish literary community, because the Finnish literary community also tends to see Russian and Russia as the only location of Russian language and Russian literature. This is part of academic tradition, so we would like to break it a bit if we can. Generally, this is what I wanted to tell about Finland, because if from the point of view of this discussion, Finland is a field which is not yet proceeded, and we just have to work on this field a lot. And I hope that we can promote Finnish cultural life, like multilingual cultural life, to the level that we should become well networked and known part of this Russophonic literary community, and we hope to make nice events as well. So thank you very much for this possibility.
Eugene asked me to add that his video presentation was slightly edited, and some parts were left out for the sake of timing. So it's important to hear his presentation in the context of him identifying himself as an American poet while speaking about Russian literature.
I'm Eugene OSTASHEVSKY. I'm Zheng OSTASHEVSKY. I can't do this live because I'm in Shanghai. Shanghai, like in the foreground, you get fake Paris, and in the background, you get fake Upchina or Prospect Mira. I live in Berlin. I identify with New York. It's just like Harms. Harms at one point said, you know, I can't really relate to Russia. I'm patriotic, but my patriotism was only about Petersburg. This is exactly how I feel about New York, or a particular kind of urban culture associated with New York. Okay, but what's Russian about my poetry? I want to start with the word Russian. My Russian identity is, in a certain sense, it's a product of American culture. I came when I was 11. Before I came, I was Jewish. It's not like I was Russian. I became Russian around the age of 11 when we immigrated. And I started to become white even later than that. My Russian language it's not always correct, never pure. I put in non-Russian words. Although I have to say that contemporary Russian, which is completely full of badly understood, now I'm going to be snobbish, but badly understood English words. And I don't know what pure Russian might be like. Russian is a language with an extremely imperialist, classist language ideology because of serfdom. It served as a class marker, served as a different class marker during the revolution. My poetry, you know Clausewitz, right? The famous line by Clausewitz that war is a continuation of politics by other means. My American poetry is a continuation of Russian poetry by other means. But in poetry, it's the means that determine everything. Form generates content. By form, I don't necessarily mean meter and rhyme. I mean, meter and rhyme are incidental. I mean, the kind of social scripts, the rules for exchanges, all these implicit rules that you take on by entering a dialogue, because if you depart from them too far, you're not going to be in the dialogue. This focus on language is to some extent Russian. If you write in Russian, you're a Russian poet, doesn't matter where you are. It shows the problem with defining things by culture and identity and tradition as opposed to language when the language is shared. Like me, all right, as a New York Russian, who am I culturally and ideologically closer to? This is going to be you know, an Anglo guy in, I don't know, South Carolina, or anywhere in rural America, really? Or is it going to be, you know, another Ashkenazi Jew from Montreal or from Toronto, right? To me, the answer is obvious. Now that I live mainly in Europe, I don't do much FaceTime in the US, and I started just posting my poems on Facebook because I mean, magazine publication is great, but send it, then it comes out in 2 years and no one reads it. And on Facebook, I'm read mostly by global Russians or by Slavists who are basically naturalized global Russians. And for Russians, I think it's very important that somebody writes in English in a way that they can relate to, in a way that has to do with linguistic experiment, in a way that comes out, that is grounded in Russian literature, in Russian poetry, and in European poetry in general. In that sense, I think my work validates being Russian, validates being global Russian, and it's a validation that's emotionally needed. Like, if you look at parents' generation, it was very, very important for them that the poetry that Brodsky wrote in English is real poetry. And that has to do with the special, incredibly powerful place of English in the world. English is the imperial language. English is how you reach the outside world. Right? If you're a Russian writer and you want international recognition, right, you're at the mercy of English. You're at the mercy of your translation. I think it's the responsibility of writers like me, of writers with like dubious, foggy, hybrid, chimerical backgrounds, to stretch, to alienate, to foreignize English, to make English more of an international language, more receptive to the needs of people for whom it's not native. Decolonization for me involves de-Americanization. It's about sabotaging American monolingualism, and it's about relativizing cultural norms and relativizing poetic practices that come with being an American poet. And this is why I'm of two minds about translation. I want American poets to read foreign languages. I want them to become global poets. And I think being global is being multilingual.
Hello, everyone. I think it's a wonderful moment for me to chip in during today's lightning round discussion, right after EUGENE sort of sets up everything for me so beautifully, because I think what I would like to suggest, and my angle is sort of the Russian perspective, or what Russian is doing at all in this wonderful colloquy. Yes, what I would like to suggest is that we need the same on the other end. That is to say, I would like to present at least an inroad to decolonizing, or at least foreignizing Russian and making Russian a global language in the same sense as EUGENE has been speaking about English. Because the question, what can I say to what Russian literature has been like recently? One thing for sure, considered en masse, there's been a sort of chokehold of nationalism-driven and common sense sanctified realism, or at least what those writers and critics call realism, which is an appalling pell-mell of late Soviet run-of-the-mill official prose, revived and continued in those endless bricks of tomes. And I listen to critics and bloggers talk the debates and can't believe my ears when I hear that evaluation essentially depends on how much of a pain in the neck a book was, as if books are written solely for their discombobulation or delectation. Why, a critic asked recently, should we care about this new book by Shamshad Abdullayev? It's riddled with allusion to foreign modernisms. All of those are completely obscure to the Russian reader, or at least to said critic. No one who, he or she said, no one who hasn't read all those Italian Hermetic poets Abdullayev delights in can ever make sense of his writings. And Abdullayev is a very interesting writer to start off this observation of mine. A Russophone poet and prose writer working, as Russian critics and scholars love to note, at the periphery, and writing in a language completely alien to his surroundings. Shamshad Abdullayev is at the same time rooted in his locale, and he's created this mesmerizingly universal world that draws on the Fergana culture, but at the same time embeds it in the broader strands of world modernisms, in particular the Mediterranean. But I would like to suggest a different perspective that does not have as much advantage to draw on the peripheral. And let's go back to the center. Let's go back to St. Petersburg. But I would start this with, obviously, a quote from whoever else, from Deleuze and Guattari, and their idea of the minor literature, which I think has been somewhat uncritically received by Russian critics, but at the same time can prove useful in this little intervention of mine. So here's what they say about the minor literature. The three characteristics of minor literature are the deterritorialization of the language, the connection of the individual and the political, and the collective arrangement of utterance, which amount to this, that minor no longer characterizes certain literatures, but describes the revolutionary conditions of any literature within what we call the great or established. And I'm really zooming in here on this phrase, within what we call the great or established. The French phrase is au sein, at the bosom, au sein de celle qu'on appelle grande ou établie. I continue with a quote. Everyone who has had the misfortune to be born in the country of a major literature must write in its tongue, as a Czech Jew writes in German, or, you'll love it, or as an Uzbek Jew writes in Russian. To write as a dog who digs his hole, a rat who makes his burrow. I've always loved Deleuze and Guattari, where I have this Uzbek writing in Russian as the supreme example of when the literature can be like. And then you, of course, are left guessing who can be that Uzbek writer they have in mind. But I would like to deterritorialize this utterance itself. For this is precisely where Deleuze and Guattari begin to drop the main pretense and explain that it is simply great writing. important, necessary writing that they're interested in, whatever the language and whatever the position. It is within the great, it burrows at the great from within. And you don't necessarily have to be that Kafka or even Abdullayev. And let's go back to St. Petersburg, as I promised you, and let's go back to a Russophone writer. Not to be scholastic, I will just give you an example. And my example here would be Alexander Ilinin, a writer who is famously self-described as скорее вепс, чем фин, a Vepsian rather than a Finn, born and raised in St. Petersburg, who wrote his first novel, I Finn, or And the Finn, this being the quote from Alexander Pushkin's «Я памятник себе воздвиг нерукотворный», wrote his first novel in 1989, wrote it in French, and wrote it while in the military, being a military interpreter, interpreting from the French, that is to say, between the French and the Russian. And he wrote it very casually, essentially just like, you know, diary or notes you would write when you're bored. A few years later, he translated into Russian and begins to publish. The novel, you know, it's sort of flagging the Finnish element in the Russian, foregrounds this marginal and queer in the both old and new sense identity, but also does very little to maintain it at the center, to maintain that sense of identity. But it is the aesthetic that the writer pursues. And in that motive of his becomes far more radical than anything that would simply take the general interpretation of Deleuze and Guattari for a recipe. To quote Ilinin from another interview, and this I think applies wonderfully to the idea of the marginal and the minor and whatever else we can do with the idea of Russian. To be a people's writer in Russian, says Ilinin, means eschewing the limited circle of the boheme or intelligentsia. Most people in Russia are marginalized. And hence he said that a people's writer is the writer who is with the people. It's a wonderful thing to say from a person who's so steeped in Western and modernist cultures, who wrote this first novel, And the Finn, in 1988, and calls it a ballet about Pushkin genre. It being both a caricature of the canon, but also a paean to everything great and everything interesting, everything open in Russian culture, who becomes later labeled by critics as a subversive officer, a cyborg and homosexual. And the military part is absolutely important to Ilinin. The quote that Eugene has just given us from Clausewitz, the continuation by other means, is essentially Ilinin's self-definition of his artistic method. So I think why, and I'm probably wrapping up here, why this matters to me and why I think this is a useful perspective on what Russian is today and what Russian can be, the Russian that is essentially translated from the French, the Russian that then becomes also this Russo-Finnic thing, is that it is nothing like Russian. And that's, I think, where I would end. Russian literature today is anything that is not Russian, is anything that at each point offers itself up as mobile, offers itself up as something that gives us striking experiences of the new, the modern, the foreign, the alien, that does not just entertain the idea of resistance, which is perhaps the more general understanding of Deleuze, does not offer itself up as resistance, seeing it as too romantic, but instead pursues in a play, in a vision of anything that is Russian literature and any determinations of Russian literature. My final word would be a little poem that Ilyin wrote back in the 90s. I'm sorry, I'm going to give you that Russian, there is no translation. Я не солнце русской поэзии. Я скорее ее вода. Переливаясь под лучами солнца или луны, волнуюсь и часто до 9-го вала. Временами совершенно спокойно и тих. Я отнимаю жар у купальщиц и купальщиков, люблю прикосновения их гладких тел, я утоляю их жажду. Есть безумные, которые бросаются в меня с моста или обрыва, как будто во мне есть покой.
I'm Tatiana RETIVOV, Russian American. I've been living in Ukraine since 1994. I'm a translator. I also am a poet. I write in both English and Russian. Also, I am a publisher. I publish books here in Ukraine. Mostly it turns out that I publish Russian literature. And of course, right now, the situation is a bit complicated with that. I just wanted to rehash the situation with the Ukrainian language. As we all know, in the 19th century, by different decrees, different tsars, Ukrainian was virtually banned from being published in literature or from being performed in the theater. In the 20th century, during the Soviet times, Ukrainian was not widely published. Many writers who lived in Ukraine, for example, like Kataev and Babil, they ended up going to Moscow. And in fact, for the longest time, really going to Russia was the only way to get published. Now, we switched to the perestroika times, and basically the golden age of publishing in the post-Soviet world, I would say, was in the past 25 years or so. It began, I would say, with the Bosporus Forum that took place in Crimea. And in fact, Crimea has been a leading influence on literature, and due to the festivals that take place there, the Voloshin Festival, the different Pushkinsky and Akhmatovsky chtenia that take place, or used to, I don't know if they still do. And this forum, which kind of morphed into what's called the Crimean Geopoetics Club, that I believe is still in existence. And it was actually created by poets who were born in Crimea, like Igor Sid and Tatiana Smolovskaya, who lives in Australia. Also, other Crimean poets of note are the deceased Raf Levin, who later moved to the United States. So pretty much I would say that Bosporus Forum kind of set the stage for the mood of the past 20 years or so, or 25 years until about 2014. And this mood was very, it was, I guess, appropriate for the end of the century. It was kind of, there was a lot of futurology, applied eschatology, conceptual art, land art. Many genres were presented in the forum, and it was just a very active scene that kind of affected, I think, the mood of the 90s. And at that point, publishing really was very free. I mean, you had the Russian archives that were open, and there was so much activity in uncovering, you know, the hidden history. I'm kind of going outside of Ukraine right now. In fact, in Ukraine, the archives were open recently. But anyway, so this golden age of publishing affected Ukraine too, because as Ukraine became independent in '93, Ukrainian authors, who were, especially those who were writing in Russian, of course, they became more sought after, and many authors ended up publishing in Russia. For example, Alexander Kabanov, who was one of the leading poets of Ukraine writing in Russian, Irina Yevsa, and well, also we have Dmitry Burago, who is more of an academic poet, and he has a publishing house himself, and he continues to publish material that kind of pulls together many poets that were writing also in Crimea and that used to travel from Moscow to Kiev. So we still have a very active literary scene here, and even though it is difficult for Russian writers to get published, it is more difficult for prose writers. In fact, since 2014, many Russian writers, for example, Alexei Nikitin, who is one of the better known prose writers, ended up no longer publishing in Russia, and he is now, continues to write in Russian. His work gets translated into Ukrainian, but he is being published now only in Ukraine. Other writers who are fairly well known, like Andrei Kurkov, he is better read and known, in fact, outside of Ukraine and outside of Russia. He's a very popular writer all over the world. He's translated, and he's on the Fulbright right now in San Diego. And he is, he's translatable, and his writing is somehow less self-referential than most Russian literature. In fact, I wanted to mention that if the more Russian literature remains kind of focused on itself and self-referential, the less of a chance it will become international the way the English language and English literature is. Other publications here, we have Radoga, which is a primarily Russian language literary journal. It was founded in Kharkiv in the 20s of the previous century, and it is published by Yuri Kovalevsky. In Donetsk, there used to be Dikaya Polya, which published a lot of interesting writing from Donetsk. And also, as I mentioned, Burago, Dmitry Burago, he publishes academic literature, as well as has a literary journal that he publishes annually, or he used to. It's called Sote. There are different, I guess, different areas of Ukraine where writers are known. For example, we have the Khersonskys, husband and wife in Odessa. There's also the poet Yuri Eugenov. And in, let's see, I guess I should mention also, we have a interesting couple who live in the Carpathians. Zagaruika, Lyudmila Zagaruika is a novelist. She's from Uzhgorod, and she writes in Ukrainian, but she mostly writes literary novels in Russian. Her husband is the poet Petro Medyanko, who writes in Ukrainian. And as far as poetry goes, I would like to say that it's a lot easier, I think, for poets, because right now, because still they get published, they participate in all kinds of online events and festivals, and there's a very dynamic, especially among young poets, a very dynamic type of exchange, because many, like Iya Kiva and Olga Bragina, Anna Gruver, Katerina Dedesheva, these are the young poets that I'm familiar with, and they translate each other back and forth from Russian to Ukrainian. And again, I think translation is really a a mechanism for expanding, I guess, the Russo-centric world and including different narratives. Also, I would like to add that a very important role is played by Dmitry Kuzmin, who relocated to Latvia. He's not Ukrainian, but he has had a major effect on all poets who write in Russian anywhere because of his publications, Babylon and Vozdukh. And he continues to, he came to Ukraine he has come here for different festivals and continues to include Ukrainian poets writing in Russian, and he translates a lot. He translates, well, mostly from English to Russian, and that has a direct influence on the Russian writing and Ukrainian writing poets here in Ukraine.
So I was asked to speak about the Caucasus, and today I want to touch on two ways that the region is significant to today's topic of defining Russian literature. First of all, obviously, the Caucasus takes up a lot of space in canonical Russian literature. It has this long history of being depicted by Russian writers, Pushkin, Lermontov, and later Tolstoy. And these depictions themselves are formative in how the Russian literary tradition comes to be defined. And as scholars in our field have long pointed out, Russian writing about the Caucasus fundamentally shaped notions of Russian national identity. In the words of our colleague Katja Håkansson, writing about the Caucasus enabled them to become the kind of Russians that they wanted to be. So in the Russian imagination, the Caucasus becomes this proving ground, this frontier where Russianness is negotiated and defined, where the boundaries are drawn between what's Russian and what's not Russian. And that's in terms of physical borders and territorial conquest, but also cultural boundaries. But crucially, the Caucasus is also this place where boundary drawing processes are disrupted and resisted, and they carry unanticipated consequences. And it's a place where both ambivalence and hostility toward Russian power comes to the surface, not only in the 19th century, but also to this day. And literature, again, has played a fundamental role in those processes. And here I'll refer to work by our colleague Rebecca Gould on the Caucasus literature of insurgency, which I really recommend checking out on this topic. So that brings me to my second point, which is that writers from the Caucasus are also engaging with this history of Russian writing about the reading. And they're often doing this in really interesting and innovative ways. They're depicting Russia and Russian state power along with their own encounters with Russian culture and their often uneven assimilation into it in order to explore their own notions of identity and create their own literary worlds. And many of this do this while writing in the Russian language, but employing various strategies to make the Russian language their own and signal their unique perspectives and distance from Russianness as they do so. So I'm going to bring up one example today that's already been mentioned by Catherine Young, and that is the writer Alisa Ganieva. She is a Russophone writer, an ethnic Avar who grew up in Dagestan in the North Caucasus, but who has been based in Moscow for her entire adult life and her entire professional writing career. And I have here Carol Apollonio's really beautiful translation of her 2012 novel, The Mountain and the Wall, Праздничная гора. So first of all, I would describe this novel as polyphonic. It contains multiple voices because a great deal of the text consists of dialogues and polemics and multi-party conversations featuring complex sociolinguistic dynamics and the negotiation of meaning, often across different local languages, including Russian. And along with that, the book contains a 7-page glossary of terms from other languages that appear in the text. mostly from Avar, but also from Arabic and other local languages in Dagestan, like Lezgian and Kalmyk, as well as pan-Dagestani terms that are used across different linguistic groups in Dagestan. And the book's central plot takes up these very issues of boundary drawing and identity that characterized Russian canonical writing about the Caucasus. The plot imagines that the Russian government has decided to construct an enormous wall separating Dagestan from the rest of Russia, and dwells on the personal and political turmoil that arises as a result. And one of the novel's main characters harkens directly back to the region's 19th century history and its depiction in Russian literature. The main character is named after Imam Shamil, the insurrection leader and folk hero who was famously depicted in Lev Tolstoy's novel Haji Marat, and who also looms large in local literature and visual culture and religious practice. And so I will end my remarks today with a quote from Ganieva's novel to this effect. So the passage I'm going to read is an excerpt from an impromptu political speech by a Kalmyk character on the streets of the city of Makhachkala, decrying the Russian government's decision to wall off Dagestan. So he says, what exactly is Moscow? Who are the Rus? The Rus are Varangians, and the Varangians are Turkic Kipchaks. We wouldn't have a language or culture if it wasn't for us. So this character's invocation of an alternative cultural history and language ideology draws our attention to the myriad ways that Russian and non-Russian cultures are co-constituted and evolved in conversation with one another and in contact with one another. And it also shows us the central role of imagination and storytelling processes in this. And my final point, I guess, is that the work of Genieva and other Moscow-based or St. Petersburg-based writers from the Caucasus reminds us that these purported geographical centers of Russian culture, and not to mention centers of Russian political and economic power, are themselves quite culturally diverse. And for that reason, the Russian language literature of the Caucasus is not only a matter of formerly colonized subjects writing back to a faraway center. Quite often, they are the center, and they have always been at the center.
I find this conversation to be absolutely timely, urgent, difficult, and exciting. My name is Polina Barskova. I am from Petersburg. For the last 20 years, I've been here in the United States. I write poetry. I write poetry in Russian. I also do write about poetry. That I do in English, mostly. And my topic today is somewhat off the main line of our conversation, but I think tangentially it's curious, and I'm very grateful to Zarina for offering that lot. Before I jump to the conversation about Russian literature being off at the moment, not only in space, but also time, I want to say that participation of all these beautiful people talking about all this spatial changes of attention, for me is awe-producing, and to mark how marvelous, like really marvelous and strange is what is happening. We have two Polinas from one grade at the outskirts of Leningrad speaking at the moment. We spent many years in one classroom, Polina Barskova and Polina Kopylova, Polina Kopylova and Polina Barskova. And now we are very far in space, but not that far ideologically, I suspect. So my topic today is what is happening in Russian literature in terms of its relationship with canon. This is how I understood the question.
And when asked by students, friends, dogs whom I befriend, how one can study one endlessly difficult period of history forever, and write about it all the time and talk about it to students all the time. I write about the blockade of Leningrad. I usually say that the problem is that, for example, blockade, though it's only one example, for us is not an event of the past, but rather the event of the present. Given the history that we are given that we've spent last 2 days like biting our nails, hoping that the first chief of the secret police won't be literally resurrected as a monument on one of the biggest squares of Moscow, which was very possible like yesterday. This conversation with eternal dread, which of the monuments might be resurrected anytime now, it gives us very unhealthy and unfortunately very interesting relationship with our history. In this perspective, the siege of Leningrad, the blockade is happening today. People are discussing it today, people are disagreeing about it today. And of course, the same is correct for the purges, for the Stalinist terror. And of course, the same is correct for various Holodomors organized by the Soviet state, not only Ukrainian one, but also the Kazakh one. All these things are, in a way, some perverse way, discursively are happening today, are happening again. And in connection to this history, we have literature where we are now discovering various authors, publishing various authors of the unusually serious scale. And this is one of many aspects that makes studying this literature so exciting, but also, I would say, it makes one rather nervous. How your literature that you thought you kind of knew, you've been teaching it for decades, how it will change tomorrow, totally, completely. Which major figure will emerge from the archive? We have various examples, even during last decade. And speaking of ghosts and monuments, we have various examples. Some very important names just emerged. I will be talking about poets from the blockade. I will name a couple of them just for simplicity of it in my case. But what the overall tendency does to us, that we have to ask ourselves the question that what actually we are dealing with. How many literatures of the 20th century do we have to reckon ourselves with? We have the official, whether we buy this term or not, Soviet literature, something that was published in unbelievable numbers of copies. You know, like when we look at them, it makes my heart of a poet, you have no idea. To bleed is not the word. We're talking, right? But then I think, of course, as every Russian poetess, about Akhmatova and 200 of running for Chotki, and one feels better in comparison to, I don't know, you name him, Simonov. So we have Soviet, the corpus. Then, of course, we have the immigration corpus, seemingly separate, of course, on many subtle levels connected, and nevertheless different realm of literature. To make things much more complicated, we have Russian language corpus, which we cannot really call Soviet, because they were not published by the Soviet state. They were either unpublished or published in Tamizdat in the West, mentioned today. And it is a completely different system of people who knew, in most cases, though it's also an interesting thing, that they were writing not to be published at their time, but at some point later. Later is kind of today, or the last decades. And we're here to work with this later. And while I was listening with total fascination to what my friends, colleagues, and classmates were just saying in terms of Russian literature, Russophone literature, changing its contours in terms of spatial alliances, conflicts, new understandings. I'm here to speak about the temporal depth and change of focus and depth of focus. For example, since I seem to be the ambassador of this poet, I'm not sure he would approve of such an ambassador. He was a shy, tactful, very wise person. I'm not sure I'm all that. But I'm talking constantly about Gennady Gor, who wrote this incredible body of poetry during and 2 months after the blockade. He survived. We have no idea how, really. He didn't die of hunger. And he wrote this 100 of poems, which we still cannot believe when we found them, thanks to his grandchildren, many, many years later. During his lifetime, and this is exceptional, he didn't read it to one living person, which is different even from Akhmatova, for example, and people like who, you know, read it to one living person or 11 living persons, which is a huge readership for the Soviet non-official. And then Gor's heirs published this. Amazing German-Austrian translator translated it and published it. Then, with help of Eugene OSTASHEVSKY and Matvey Yankelevich and Ainsley Morse and many other kind and difficult and people, we created this anthology, Written in the Dark, 5 Poets in the Siege of Leningrad, which is, I think, is such an interesting English version of the blockade poetry that I hear all the time from young poets in New York, for example. In New York, even before the pandemic, blockade was popular in New York, which we can think why. That this poetry, including poetry by Gor, is influencing them now, which is, I think, this is what is interesting. This is how strangely connections occur and influences arise. To some extent, Gor and Zaltzman might become a phenomenon of the glitterati, gloomy life in Brooklyn. I hope so. So here is the poem. We just celebrated a publication of Gor's new volume of his poetry and prose in Petersburg. So 2021, he really comes out of silence, out of the shadows. And this is absolutely paradoxical. This is not how it's supposed to be in a normal literary situation, but we're not interested in normal. Кошачье жаркое, и гости сидят за тем же столом. На хлеб я гляжу, кости считаю, и жду, когда гости уйдут. Но вот входит тесть, смерть, сон. Гостей на салазках везут, меня на салазки кладут и везут. Навстречу идет почтальон, телеграмма от жены. Жду. Стекла сияют, солнце кричит. Деревья стоят, утонув навсегда. Дома утонули, и люди в подштаниках в пустоте, где воздух едят. И сердце стучит, и зовет к жене. Осанки скрипят, все скрипят и скрипят. И вот уже устала весна, бросилась снег. На дороге я синий лежу. Сегодня.
I'm Ruthia. I'm an artist from Kazakhstan, Almaty. I work in KRёlex Center, which is an imaginary art center that is designed for people with, you know, multiple identities or people without nationality. And the word krёlex is a derivative from Creole. So it's also made up. I am not a Russian person, and I know that sometimes for the others, this fact that I am not Russian is difficult to understand or comprehend. I don't know why, but I have one idea about that. So very briefly, there was a post on Facebook like about 2 years ago. Galina Rimbo made a post that collected more than 300 commentaries. She wrote that for her it was difficult to use terms like Russian poet or Russian literature or Russian text because of, you know, because of everything. And so she asked her readers, how does it feel, how's it for them, what kind of words they use in this respect. And most of the commented followers, they agreed, like in the commentaries, they agreed that Russian literature is the only way that we can describe it. Of course, one can identify as whoever. We can invent our identities ad infinitum, but there is a reality, and in reality there is no Russian language literature, Russian language as an adjective, русскоязычная. So there is no русскоязычная литература, no Russian language literature, because de facto everyone who writes in Russian today is a Russian writer. And I tried to interfere in that conversation and said that in KRёlex Center we use the term Russophone. We began to use it after we picked it up from Victoria Torstensen, who teaches the course titled Contemporary Kazakhstani Russophone Literature in the university in Astana. And the answers were like answers from not from the casual, you know, Facebook users, but from the leading figures in contemporary literature scene. The answers were like mostly that Kazakhstani Russophone literature does not objectively exist, as do exist Anglophone literature, Francophone literature. It can only come into being after some hundreds years of growing as an independent system of institutions and publications and discourses, and it has to produce eventually a new type of consciousness. Only after that we can say that, okay, there is like Russophone literature. So basically I was told that if I want to align myself with the reality, I better admit that I am Russian. And I have absolutely the same conversations regarding my gender. Oftentimes people are ready to put up with the fact that I call myself like this and that, upon the condition that I must admit that objectively I am a male, and as a honest man, I have to respect this as a, the fact of nature. For me, there is a striking resemblance between how we try to defend, for instance, gender dichotomy as a scientific fact, and how do we tend to naturalize national culture or nation as something that is ontologically privileged, so to say. And that's why we in krёlex Center we use the term queer or krёlex exactly to avoid this framing culture in terms of national. And so we by the end I think I should show the one compilation that we published. It is called, it's a compilation of queer poetry, which includes texts by 21 authors from various countries. The compilation is titled Under One Cover. And as we wrote in preface, the criteria for selection was unclear even for us, because we have difficulties with defining poetry, and these difficulties were multiplied by the difficulties with defining queer. So the result cannot be explained in a consistent way.
I'm a poet and a translator. I write in Russian and English, and I translate from Lithuanian, Russian, and English. I'm also a clinical psychologist by training. I grew up in Lithuania. At 18, I went to study psychology in Moscow University, got married, and I immigrated to the United States 12 years later. And I came to America 4 months after my arrival. I started working as a psychologist in Coney Island, and a big part of my career was training other clinicians to work with this population of Homo Sovieticus, of immigrants from the Soviet Union. I was teaching in different schools of social work, and 1 year traveled around the country. And basically, I was struggling with this, struggling with American psychologists, accusing them of ethnocentrism, not understanding this population, putting all of them in some kind of neurotic or borderline spectrum. This is where I will end that part. When we talk about Russian literature in Lithuania, it's very, very complex. And I think we're venturing into Shakespearean territory, where the word betrayal is used quite a bit. Lithuania definitely has, Lithuanian culture has a connection to Russian culture. Tomas Venclova, the preeminent intellectual, is known as translator of Czesław Miłosz and Joseph Brodsky. Joseph Brodsky found refuge in Lithuania, where he was hiding from KGB, and had very close friends there. I, as a kid, attended like a circle of Russian poetry by my teacher, who then was fired for teaching poets of, poets like Mandelstam, Tsvetaeva, and Akhmatova, and inviting dissidents such as Tomas Venclova to that circle. So, this started when I was 14. When I went back to Lithuania after a break of 28 years, I found that this city that is actually a city of culture and poetry, poetry written in Polish and Lithuanian and in Yiddish, I found that the city was ethnically cleansed, basically, that instead of 5 languages that I heard growing up, that were Lithuanian, Russian, Polish, Belarusian, Yiddish, you basically heard Lithuanian. I was shocked to see that the Museum of the Victims of the Genocide was the museum of Lithuanian partisans, fighters for their independence, that basically were all
exterminated from 1945 to 50. So this was different Lithuania. This is also a country that is famous for Holocaust denial and basically lies about Lithuanian complicity in murdering 200,000 Jews out of 240,000 in the first 3 months of German occupation. And so this is a country with very complex past. I went to a Lithuanian English school, and in the school we had so-called evenings of friendship, Večera družby, where kids from Russian schools came, and Russian kids read Lithuanian poetry, and kids from my school read Russian poetry. And after the evening, usually there was a colossal fist fight, you know, in the courtyard. So that was the history of friendship. So I just have to, I have very close connections to Lithuanian poetry community, if you will. I translated about 10 Lithuanian poets. My books were translated into Lithuanian and got prizes in Lithuania. But when you speak to Lithuanian poets of generation that grew up still in the Soviet Union, who know Russian, they are very reserved when you speak about Russian poetry. There is little sort of communication or interconnection that goes on in Kaliningrad festivals. But when you say Antanas Joninas, who was the head of the Writers' Union, oh, why doesn't anybody translated Dragomoshenko into Lithuanian? Or you name any poet, Gandosman, you know, the answer is, you know, whatever, we don't know. So I just have to describe it because Kevin asked us to go very personal, to describe just 2 minutes of a scene that took place at the presentation of my book called Vilnius Diary, which is a big part of it is about coming to Vilnius that in a way is empty because my non-Lithuanian friends are gone. It's partly a cemetery or some kind of museum where I just see these empty buildings and empty apartments and I think of people that are no longer here. And so at the presentation in the Writers' Union, 8 of my classmates came in. I mean, I'm always greeted very warmly by my classmates. They follow me, they just travel with me to my presentations in Lithuania. But after this book was presented and they asked, do you have questions to the author? One of my classmates got up and said, Anna, you grew up with us and we were all friendly, but I think you betrayed us. You betrayed us because you write poetry in Russian, you went to study in Russia, you married a Russian man, you don't know what his father did during the war. Maybe he was one of the Russian oppressors who, you know, was killing Lithuanian intellectuals in, there is a famous place, Rainių Forest, and so on and so forth, which caused a huge kind of, you know, people were petrified. And I basically had to answer this. And I said, I know him quite well. You know, we sat in the same class for 11 years. So I said, Gintaras, I don't need to apologize for writing in my mother tongue. Educated people in Russia that was a part of Russian Empire spoke Russian. There was no higher education in Lithuania. Second, I don't need to apologize for going to Russia to study psychology. There were other non-Jewish Lithuanian students there. And the third, maybe my first husband's father was not a good man, and it's possible he was doing horrible things during the war, but I'm not going to hold my husband accountable because during Stalin's purges, people went to Gulag for their sisters, brothers, husbands, wives, and mothers. So we're not going to do this. And then finally I said, I remember you being a Lithuanian patriot, but also being a member of the Komsomol. And, but I wasn't, so whatever. So in the end, this somehow resolved, even though one of the attending editors came to him and he said, "You should just shut up. This woman is a poet and you are nobody." Everything ended peacefully in a restaurant where my classmates invited me for dinner, and he brought me a bouquet of flowers. So when it comes to Lithuania, the word betrayal is, you know, most people know about Rūta Vanagaitė's book. You know, Rūta Vanagaitė, who wrote about the Holocaust in Lithuania, and literally was expelled from it for 4 years and threatened and so on. So Russia is evil empire. Russia is an occupier. Here, look at Belarus, that they're just like, you know, oppressing, and the next thing they will come to us. So when you speak about Russian poetry in this country, it's become, as I said, it's a very painful topic. And even though Antanas Joninas translated my poetry from Russian, Marius Burok is from English, and they know Russian, or they knew Russian literature. They speak Russian. They had Russian friends growing up. But somehow, at this point, I think there is such a huge, I think there is a huge trauma separating these two countries. And I don't see how it can be fixed, even compared to Ukraine and Belarus that have much closer ties to Russia, and Russia sees them and such. Lithuanians are somehow protected by, you know, they have a history of Russian Empire drawing walls against the Tsar in blood. So, you know, so also, I have not met any young Russians writing in Russian in Lithuania. There are ethnically Russian poets writing in Lithuanian at this point. People that are writing in Russian are people of older generation. I really don't know of any like Russian poetry that is alive in Russia at this time. They're always looking towards the West because they always feel threatened by Russia. Just the last thing, talking about identity. In one of my poems, I just wrote a line. I'm Russian, Lithuanian, American Jew. So probably writing in Russian and in English.
I kind of find myself wishing it could just go on and on. I have gotten into this sort of rhythm of listening to these sort of lightning but rich statements from all of you. But I think at this point we're going to segue into questions. I'll just like add a kind of little end cap to all of these presentations to say, to relate a little anecdote. A couple of years ago, I was editing a book that was, it started out maybe 10 years ago. I was thinking of calling it something like Peripheral Russian Cultures or something like that. And I had a number of conferences, brought a bunch of people together, and was, you know, working on the title of this book forever, and on the, you know, conceptual category. I could fit all of the things that I wanted to go into this edited book into. And what the book eventually came to be called was Global Russian Cultures. One of the last things I did actually was include a chapter, about Russian culture in Russia, because one of the things I realized was that on the one hand, the term Russian is here, you know, ontological or not, the term is here and people use it. Many people use it for many different things. Yet the political move that I wanted to make was to detach it from specific economic or political matrices that could wrangle it and claim monopolistic power over it. So global Russian cultures seemed to be the place to go with it, in the sense that on the one hand, there are many cultures, so it had to be in the plural, Russian cultures. And in the second place, that all Russian cultures are global. The Russian culture which is produced in Russia, the many different Russian cultures which are produced in Russia is global. It rises out of particular places, yet it all actually occupies the globe as a whole. But the same could be said about Boris Khersonsky, or Zhenya Ostashevsky, or Dina Rubina, or many other names that we could name, people who are producing things which are called by someone Russian culture in very many different places. The other thing I wanted to interject, though, is that, you know, it came up in our discussions a bit, but I think perhaps in an unstructured way, there is an unequal world of economic power and of political power that has unequal grasp on these categories, that can broadcast the use of this term Russian literature in the singular to the majority of Russian speakers in the world, which is still located in the Russian Federation, and claim certain kinds of ontological statuses for both the Russian part and the literary part of that term. There are also generic differences between the, you know, the status of the term when we apply it, right? When we speak about prose, Pascal Casanova, when she writes about the World Republic of Letters, claims that it's hierarchically structured around national states and national literary centers which control the passage into global resonance. And I think that in some sense that might be true for fiction, right? If you want to write fiction in Russian and gain some kind of global resonance, you have to pass through perhaps Exmo Press, as does Dina Rubina. It's completely unclear to me that that's the case for poetry. In some sense, because poetry is so fully delinked, or not fully, but so much more delinked from economic mechanisms than is prose in our world. So I think there are a lot of dimensions to this problem that are hovering around us. On the one hand, an urge to liberate Russian cultures from the structures that might try to grab hold of them and use them for their own purposes. On the other hand, the reality that those structures exist and that there is unequal power expressed through economic and political institutions in different places in the world over these terms that we all want to use.
I also wanted to express my gratitude to all the participants of the session. It really is listening to you all. I think I was just sort of fleshing out in my mind just how much of a fraught territory we're entering, bringing up questions that seem almost divorced from life and scholastically schematic categories. But listening to you quote from your personal examples and life experience, it just became so much more alive to me that, you know, when we go back to that quote from Nabokov, who expressed his own predicament as, my head speaks English, my heart speaks Russian, and my ear speaks French, just how much of a non-elitist and a real division and difference-riddled existence and condition it is for all of us, for all our readers, and for all the writers that we discuss, whether or not they are based in Lithuania or St. Petersburg or Fergana. The question that I wanted to pose is not so much a question as a sort of an invitation to expand, and this would be to LIZA MICHAELI. I really was very moved by the articulation that you shared with us of the condition of the Russophone and especially the Russian in Israel. I think I would be even more fascinated to hear about certain details. If you could perhaps quote or refer to examples. I myself am very interested in the Russian literary milieu in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, but it doesn't have to be established or marginal Russian writers from out there. I'm just curious how that general experience of, I would say, contamination that you described, how that feeds into the experiences of reading, writing, and the circulation of texts in your experience and in general in how you see the situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that extraordinary question. And also thank you to everyone. It's a tremendous honor. It's a very difficult question to address because I think part of the invitation is for me to speak about my experience or the experiential dimension of this linguistic reality. and another part is to render, is to offer a kind of scholarly input, or which is actually a distinction that I tried very hard, and I do try very hard to maintain, which is, I guess, tangentially something that I've noticed from all of the speakers here is the ranges of approach, or the range of approaches to the so-called topic, the object, the experience, the term, the subject matter. For some, it's been a way of approaching professionally from without, for others, experientially from within. And this real distinction between linguistic experience and then linguistic practice, I think, puts into question what it means to be in contact, to improvise this contact, to calibrate it, to manage it, and to inhabit it in a non-elitist way, as a way that you cannot help in the first place. I think that, I mean, the way that this materializes or is felt in Israel is just the sense in which languages, they contaminate one another, and there really is this sense of fluctuation in the environment, in the milieu itself, this resistance, this visceral reaction to Russian, or to Russianized Hebrew, or any combination of those things. I think that there are several established journals that I could name, or even just commitments that people have to, that a Russian who's been living in Israel has to speaking in Hebrew, or just to speaking in Russian, to refusing that contamination which somehow imposes itself anyway. And there are others who insist on this hybridity. But in any case, that influence, the way in which these forces determine one another, I think is something that I've attempted to say is not within our control. And I'm sorry if that doesn't, with in the realm of specificity, it doesn't address your question at all.
No, but it certainly offers even more ground to consider it. Thank you. And thank you in particular for the distinction that you tried to stress in your answer, that is between the experiential and the analytical approach. I appreciate that very much.
I'm Ainsley Morse. I like to hang out at Globus Books. I am a translator. I teach Russian language and literature at Dartmouth College. And I usually, I write mostly about Soviet era poetry, I guess, and contemporary. So there's a question for me and the other translators here about the role of translation in some of these questions. And then, I mean, my question is kind of for everyone, and it's a general one. I actually was thinking more about some practical ideas for those of us who teach so-called Russian literature. I would love for some of that to be addressed further. We heard from several people who teach. And I think that there are questions of received canon and ideas about Russian culture that are very relevant for those of us who translate and for those of us who teach. And this is extending the question to people like Matvey, who are going to speak to what publishing can do. My answer as a translator, I feel like I am totally lost. I discuss these issues with my students. I try to translate stuff that I can give them so that we can read it, and expand the field of what writing in Russian can mean. At the same time, I feel like in the academy, as POLINA said in the beginning of her presentation, we are only just getting to the point where a conversation about official, unofficial, émigré, also speaking to YASHA, is considered a part of what we teach when we teach like 20th century Russian literature. I feel like that's a newborn baby norm, right? And so then if we're only just starting to accommodate stuff like that, and that's a huge task for translators. A lot of my work so far as a translator has been expanding the canon to include émigré and unofficial writers. And then there's this vast field, of course, of other writing in Russian that might not have anything to do with the geographical boundaries or some kind of kokoshniki beryozy idea of Russian culture. And that, for me, is a huge issue in teaching Russian language, because our textbooks for teaching Russian language are not global. They are not global, they are heteronormative, they are, I mean, whatever, you name it, they're very white. And so I feel like I would love to hear just along some of these more theoretical considerations, I would love to hear if anybody has very practical suggestions for the kinds of incremental changes that would lead to really a paradigm shift of the sort that is needed. So thank you very much. It was wonderful to listen to everyone.
Ainsley's comments, in some sense, add another category of, you know, the approach to the question of what is Russian literature, to the ones that Lisa and Yvonne were talking about, in the sense that, you know, it's really a question of what you want to do with your term and what you want to do with your Russian literature. Everyone gets to do a different thing, and some people have to do things with them. For those of us who teach and are assigned by the institution to teach Russian literature, we face this question in this very pragmatic way. You know, what are we supposed to be teaching then if we've been told that we're Slavicists responsible for something called Russian literature? Which is a very different question from the question of being thrown into a literature which was your mother tongue, that may or may not bear the traces of violent histories, you know, inscribed on your family, and you have to decide, you know, how you're going to adapt this into your identity as a person and as a writer, which is very different again from the question of the you know, person who's born into a Russian language community and wants to pick up a book in their mother tongue and decide, you know, what they're going to call it. Is this a Russian literature book that I'm looking at? Is that why I'm choosing it, or am I choosing it because it was written by someone who grew up in the same city as me in New York? It's a question, a pragmatic question, which looks differently from different subject positions.
And thanks all. I've enjoyed this discussion so much, and what Kevin said about getting into this sort of flow where you just want to hear another presentation of the same nature is definitely something that resonates with me. So I'm Pilako, and I am a translator and researcher. I'm a student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I have been translating what I also term Russophone literature, and now working primarily with Juri, which is language spoken by Jurho, known in Russian primarily as Gorski Evrei. So I guess now I'm looking at this, the Russophone question also kind of со стороны. But I think that the question that was addressed to me in the chat had to do with a recent project that is stemming directly from that term, which is the current issue of Words Without Borders, which is an online Anglophone literary journal. And for this special issue, I guess for me it was basically this question of institutional maneuvering, institutional power. Like, there is definitely this issue of stereotyping, where in the Anglophone literary sphere, if you want to have a broad conversation, like a broadly accessible conversation about Russian literature, there is this heavy baggage that's present not only of place, but also of language and also of race. And this project of basically bringing together like 24 or so collaborators from California to Ulyanovsk, and trying to break through the equivalence between Russophone and Russian that exists currently in the broader US Anglophone sphere. that's what this project was about. So if anyone feels like checking it out, Catherine Young's work is also featured, and of course it was a very limited project, but that's that. In terms of questions that that I have, I think the number one thing that's coming to mind in listening to these presentations is that the question isn't like what are we describing? Is it Russian? Is it Russophone? The question is what do these terms do and who do they fit? Right? Because Russian fits some people, Russophone fits others, post-Soviet fits others, and there are overlaps in those groups. And I think it's interesting and difficult to think about the ways in which Russian tends not to fit in Central Asia, tends not to fit in the Caucasus, tends not to fit in a lot of territories that have been subjected to Russian governance. And along those lines, I feel as though it's possible to think about like, okay, what is the broader framework for Russophone literatures or post-Soviet literatures if it's not Russian? So that's where my question comes in. Like I was thinking, Zarina, as you were speaking, about writing in English and being considered a Russian writer of the Cheburashka Collective, which is a group in the US that never associates itself with the word Russian, as far as I know. I think Olga is here. Yes, thank you. I was so hoping you would turn your camera on right at that moment. Like, I think that the characterization is typically like writers whose lives have been shaped by immigration from the Soviet space. Like the word Russian never figures there. So I have a dual question basically to Zarina and Olga on one hand, like what is the framework for your work if not Russian? Is it in the US? Is it Russophone, post-Soviet? And then to RUTHIA as well, I'm wondering, like, when you talk about Russophone literature, the broader framework, it's not as though Russophone is within a Russian literature. So what broader frameworks do you see like for terms like Russophone and terms like krёlex that are not necessarily the one that we're talking about mostly today?
Thank you for asking that. And I'm also very happy to have Olga here to join in with her perspective. And I wanted to hear from Cheburashka, and in my plan that is to do a show on Cheburashka separately here with Globus, a very interesting project. As for myself, when asked, or rather not asked, or presented as a Russian poet or Russian writer, I have a novel and short story collections. As a Russian writer, I tend to explode and condemn the presenters for not paying attention. And then of course I feel bad because why would they know? I speak with a heavy Russian accent, make mistakes, and they are to assume that I'm Russian, while I'm not ethnically Russian, just that little bit. And I've been only writing in English, publishing only in English. Not a line of mine appeared anywhere in any Russophone space. So to me, it's an identity issue. What RUTHIA said really resonated with me. It's being pigeonholed somewhere by your external circumstances, your appearances. Like being, say, presented as a blonde doesn't help, but I choose to have this image. That's what I want to be. But how do I identify? It's another question. My father always used to say that we are rootless cosmopolitans, безродные космополиты. And what really was a shaping experience for me is that for the extent of most of my life, as I was growing in St. Petersburg, Russia, I've been hearing «Бей жидов, спасай Россию», so kill the Kazakhs and save Russia. That doesn't go unnoticed. So that kind of formed me there. I didn't identify as Russia. And then I decided to go to Israel at a very young age. And I went, and there the Israeli police arrested me on board of a ship from Cyprus. They let down on land all these big new Novorossians, new Russians with their golden teeth and golden chains. And I was the only one who was practically arrested. They strip searched, they arrested my passport, and they told me, you are Russian, you look suspicious, we don't like you. And I thought, like, heck, so it's not here either. And then for a while, I thought that maybe I am American, and then Trump happened, and that became impossible, kind of. So I think I'm back to being a ruthless cosmopolitan and a global citizen, and just a cheburashka, I suppose, whatever that means. And, you know, like, really, what I think, again, being an emotional writer, is a nationality. My nationality is a writer. My realm is literature. That's why I'm doing these shows, because that's where I feel I belong, with all its complexity and with all its mass, what Anna Halberstadt is talking about, or you know, TATIANA, RETIVOV, you know, like, we have a lot of intensity. Yes, there's a lot of war going on. Language is a political matter, but it's the country where I feel at home. So hope I answer the question. Thank you.
Basically, what I'm thinking about is, we've been talking about this broad framework of Russian literature and how people fit into Russian literature from, you know, from a perspective rooted in Lithuania or in Finland. But as you've articulated, your work doesn't fit in that framework. Like, right. Or you don't fit that work in that framework. So I'm wondering, Russophone is one framework that you described, but in terms of geography, like, there's another framework that I was hoping you could speak to, whether it's on the level of the city or like, or more broadly. So I'm curious, like, since like this, you know, within Russian literature, you know, Russian literature in Finland fits with Russian literature in Lithuania fits with Russian literature in Israel. So for you, your Russophone literature, what does it fit with?
I don't feel that it does fit in any sense, because, you know, because there is a certain lack of terms, and I feel certain lack of vocabulary too, because I don't know how to even talk about it without because it feels like I'm the first person to talk about things, and that's why precisely we borrowed this term krёlex, and you know, and distorted it into krёlex, into something, you know, because we needed to make it ours. So we have to borrow from Caribbean in our case, from other parts of the world that somehow because when I was reading, for instance, Edouard Glissant's Poetics of Relations, I felt that it was about us as well. So that's why I decided that, okay, they are Creoles, so why can't we be like them? Because I don't know what kind of words, what kind of language can be. I mean, I don't know any, so I feel like I'm the first person to speak about myself, as if it is, you know, never been talked before. So I don't know, but in terms of the literature of the scene, most of the writers and poets who I know from Central Asia, kind of, you know, I mean, the circles from in Almaty, they mostly use Russian literature, Russian writer, as far as I know, and they kind of don't see it as a problem because they are Russian people living in Kazakhstan, and but not all of us, of course, feel that way, and I think we are just starting to you know, to find these, like, our own pigeonhole, so to say. Yeah, thank you for the question.
What a great discussion. I'm Olga Levshin. I write in English. I used to write in Russian and English, and a weird hybrid combination thereof. The chaos that goes on in my head most days. I was brought to this country at 14 from Russia. Before that, I lived in Ukraine, was born in Odessa with its internationalism, and I'm Jewish. Ura. I'm very interested in this idea of Russophone as a counterpart to Francophone, or literatures in Spanish, global literatures in Spanish. because of its potential to be anti-nationalist. At a time when there's so much anti-globalizing, and so much nationalism brewing, whether it's the nationalism and it's a nationalism that excludes. So what Anna Halberstadt referenced in her Lithuanian experience, and what I see happening in the United States under Trump or not under Trump, we still have, plenty of people who believe in America for Americans. I find that whatever phone, it could be a Russian phone, it could be other phone, the more one detaches from these nationalist interests, I think the more one can find nuance and complexity. And I think ultimately that is the task of most literature. Even on the level of storytelling, what Anna told us about her experience with her classmates. I was bringing home my 9-year-old son as he was listening to this experience about classmates, and these relationships that are forged at an early age, the tenacity of which is so important. I think is an interesting factor here. How do we tell the stories that exist outside of these national ideologies, beside them, that contradict the narrow repertoires of stereotypes? We do so in a way that, per what Anna said, that is specific, that avoids these mega and meta narratives. And we hope that there's something there that can overcome. And one other aspect, and I think one important component of this storytelling that I want to throw in is the concept in much American literature since, the rise of the civil rights movement, is story. It can be many things, but it is fundamentally intersectional, right? So in Anna's case, it combines Jewishness, speaking 5 languages at a home, the marriage to one's first spouse, the marriage to one's second spouse, a nonconformist artist, world renowned, right? And it's only at those intersections and beyond even the complexities that exist beyond just power and privilege, but also entail things like childhood and childhood memories, the sounds and textures of the languages we speak. It is in the telling of these stories that I think you can achieve a greater amount of understanding. The second component that I would point out as significant, both in Anna's stories and in what I work with as teacher of children. So I teach children creative writing. Most of my students are first-generation Americans. It's very interesting to see what they can come up with. They come in so much more open-minded without those ideologies. They are with ideologies, but they're flexible. And I think it's super important to consider the role of children's literature and YA or young adult literature in the formation of these individual consciousness, to start as young as possible on this road of story, because this is how we see each other. Children don't know yet about nations, but they know about their classmates, and they know about their individual teachers, right? And that, I think, is part of why, I wasn't there, but the way you told the story, Anna, it was very powerful that your classmate who has those decades of seeing you as an individual, that you were saying it at the same time as it's extremely difficult to live in a world of nationalism, but he brought you flowers. I find that extremely charming. And so then kind of to backtrack to Cheburashka, which was mentioned, and is a sort of weird mascot because he himself was also co-opted, or she or they, they were co-opted for the Russian Olympic Games as a mascot. But, kind of finding that childlike, look, the big brown pleading eyes, the kind of emotional, right? Kind of inserting the emotion in this kind of very rational analysis of our experience. There's something about that in our little group of poets from the countries of the former Soviet Union, there's something there that kind of draws us together. And I think that again is childhood when emotions are perfectly appropriate, when we control ourselves less. And so between childhood and story, I really feel like there is, and memory of childhood, I really feel as if there is something that is powerful and that can withstand these ideologies that view us as these like straw figures. So thanks for letting me vent.
So glad that Francophonie got a mention. I was thinking that we had to mention, in fact, that, the problem of, definition and also power and economics and geography nation, former empire, is really not just a Russian problem in this world. And we did mention the Anglophone dimension at one point, EUGENE very powerfully did, but there's also Sinophone literatures, Francophone literatures, global Hispanophone literatures. And we should also recall that, you know, there are similar problems, cognate problems, but also problems that have their own complex histories and present realities. Each of those cases, the relationship between the former metropole and the extent of the linguistic and population dispersal throughout the world is different. But in each of those cases, the former metropole also attempts to make of the global Russian or the global Chinese or the global French what it wants. So that this, even this, you know, Russophonia or global Russian is not a completely even playing field or a space of unadulterated liberation. And there's also a question that came in from the YouTube chat, which was directed at translators. And there are many translators here with us about, you know, who is the hardest Russian poet to translate, which is a question that I've gotten before as a translator myself. And I find it to be a hard question to answer.
It's great to be here. This is a fascinating discussion and really timely, if not, you know, we're always late.
Maybe you should also, if you feel up to it, address this question of how you have coped with the question of identity yourself. Is there anything Russian in Matvey Yankovlevich as a poet?
I hesitate to talk about that because I haven't prepared anything and it could be vague. But a number of things came up in the discussion I found fascinating, and I wanted to maybe address a couple or make a couple comments that might be like questions to further the discussion. As far as the hardest to translate, I think that's a very interesting formulation because it is really hard to know what people mean by that. What is the point of translation? It's sort of assumed that we share the question, the person asking the question, the person answering it share some idea of what translation is, which is very unlikely. And at least if the question is framed in that way, one starts to think, well, what did the questioner want the translation to do? What kind of carrying over or equivalencies were supposed in that question? I think probably the hardest thing for translation is making something readable in a new context, right? And I think a lot of our conversation, or your conversation today, has been about context. Writing in Russian in Kazakhstan is different from writing in Russian in Lithuania or in Israel or in the States, and very different from writing in Russian in Russia, right? And it's also very different writing in Russia if you're not ethnically Russian. In the Soviet period, through a kind of propaganda of internationalism and the sort of propaganda of various kinds of national identity, and we know all of it was partly disingenuous, and we know about the persecution of ethnic minorities, but we also know that there were seriously respected Soviet writers from most republics, right, who were not ethnically Russian, and that internationalism has, that has kind of faded away in the demise of the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of good reasons for it. And also there's something to consider about what we're missing, as that has left us in the wake of the Cold War also, creating kind of national identities as stronger national identities, right? Thinking about context and thinking about translation, I was really interested in Zhenya's point about, well, about decolonializing English and making English more open to the languages of the world. But also, at the same time, Zhenya said that he is a poet who's writing from the Russian tradition into English. And in that, I hear also a presupposition of what the Russian tradition is that he's writing from. How do we know what is a Russian tradition? Is Russian poetic tradition all about language-centered form and so forth? Some of us would argue, or some of us have different experiences, and certainly in contemporary Russian literature that's been destabilized as a kind of like the modernist mode has been destabilized. On the other hand, another kind of writing maybe that forwards narrative and story has emerged with the advent of strong identitarian politics. And those things are very linked. And I wonder, we have a representative from Cheburashka, and how does a US, let's say just your average reader who doesn't have a context, a Soviet culture nostalgia thing, like what is Cheburashka? It's a foreignizing word. It's maybe something that destabilizes, decolonializes English, the way Zhenya suggests, but it's also totally unreadable. In other words, invisible. And therefore, we as identitarian groups keep coming up with ways of making ourselves invisible more and more, right? In a sense, by not knowing what it is that can be translated, or how to translate. I mean, it's a hard thing. So because, as Zhenya said, there are rules of the dialogue, and if you stray too far from those rules, it's like you're not talking, right? Your mode of, and I think this is true for Zhenya's work, he engages with American poetic traditions as well, and that's how he makes some kind of wedge of this, what he perceives as a Russian tradition, which we could call just a particular specific Russian tradition. He wedges that into the American sphere or the English language sphere in some way, by also looking or being conscious of the rules of that game. And so these contexts are, if we think of them in a game format, in terms of a kind of play or ludic activity that maybe destabilizes, decolonializes to some degree, or we can think about the rules that apply, and so translation is always dealing with two different rule systems, right, game systems, and has to attempt to make that game work in the new sphere, new context. And I guess I mean, maybe it's a little bit people like Vanya mentioned how Shamshad Abdullayev is basically ignored by that critic, this idea of shutting down and saying this work is invisible, unreadable to me, because I have to know these allusions and so forth. And that's sort of the Russian national attitude toward something foreign, and that's a beautiful way of talking about it through Shamshad's writing. And Shamshad is, of course, visible to a larger context of people speaking the modernist or playing the modernist or postmodernist game, right? So he's readable to me or to Vanya or to the people who want to read him. When we were at Penn with Shamshad translating him, clearly they're readers, but they may not be Russian language readers, all of them. But his work can be or has been translated in such a way that it can function in a new context. It's still strange, right? It's still strange to that context, and still causes the reader to adjust to it with its imagery, with its context, and so forth. But it isn't readable to the Russian nationalist kind of critic, right? Who refuses those foreign elements and finds, and in a sense, has to translate Shamshad because Shamshad is somehow foreign, even though he's writing in Russian. So I'm curious about that example because in a sense, that is a place where an attempt to make that writing invisible by the Russian critic. And I wonder about the connection, like the way that, and this is perhaps maybe a difficult thing to think about, but where do we go from here when we no longer have the utopian kind of internationalist impulse to consider all people writing in a language as part of that literature, right? And we have a kind of, I barely know and really don't really read, because I can't read in the sense of make visible to me like a lot of Israeli Russian writing. It's just not visible to me in a sense that I don't, even though I'm Jewish, etc., like I don't understand the context or I don't feel it, it's not like I can't, but it's not something. And similarly, like Russians writing in Russian in the US, oftentimes I don't feel the context, they don't feel the work because it's involved in a game that I'm not playing. And so the Russophone world is extremely disparate, and even within Russia, if you have like F letter or and the critic that judges Shamshad Abdullahev's work as invisible, right? You have two, very different spheres that operate, alternative cultures that operate outside of these sort of centralizing discourses. But it's interesting that the part of the reason that this disparateness happens is that so much relies on narrative and the story of identity, which always causes a kind of delineation, right? And people will say, the Russian writer or the Swedish writer, right? And the Swedish writer might be a refugee from Syria, or it could be an ethnic Swede, right? And then there are these further divisions, and if the national literature cannot accommodate this, or the idea of the national literature cannot accommodate these disparate groups, and closes itself off in this monolithic anti-internationalist way, then that's the model that is kind of persistently like the episteme of intersectionalism, for instance. It supposes that there are different groups, right, that have to intersect, but they each maintain their identities. And so this is the space we're in. We're trying to navigate in some way these, some, both like the bad side of the, vision of a national literature, utopian aspect of that also, and that people could be connected through language no matter where they are. And have the same standing no matter if they're writing from a different ethnically oriented or gender position, rather than some kind of exclusive national literature that is ethnicity based to some degree or aesthetically based, right? Or we have on the other hand this idea of like a difficult, constant delineation of identities that creates the need for intersectionalism, but that intersectionalism is founded on the idea that those parties can never actually be in a whole, in a relationship of wholeness. So I don't know, I'm curious about how these, and how that's linked to the difficulty, the critique of the novel, the critique of narrative, that is, I think, an important aspect of, because narrative always builds identity and is always, especially with the novel, very much a middle-class formation. with its own kind of, moral rules and so forth, ethics, and I'm curious how that plays into this discussion. But yeah, thanks again. It's like so many interesting presentations and beautiful work that everyone's doing. So maybe some of what I said will spur some conversation, I hope.
I think it would spur so much conversation. I want to voice a question that came in through the YouTube chat, which was, so how would you define now русскоязычный писатель, русскоязычная писательница? And I think it resonates with what Matvey was just saying, that there are a multiplicity of ways that these terms are used and defined, but also that it's an uneasy multiplicity to think that we could just like end the conversation by saying, well, lots of people do it in lots of different ways, doesn't actually take into account the quite fraught questions of conflict between different ways that people pose these questions, and also the differing categorical implications of the way that we imagine what it means to have difference, or sameness or hybridity. That all of those abstract categories are in fact imbued with certain kinds of ontological implications, right? Are we hybrid between, given set somehow identifiable categories of wholeness, and then we imagine these interstitial positions, or are we actually imagining a world in which the wholeness seeps away entirely? Clearly, whatever we imagine has, very little power over how other institutions, polities, states, economic institutions are going to lay hold of and do their work with these categories and distinctions. At the beginning of our discussion, I said that we were going to open things up and not close them down together here today. So I'm not that worried that we're leaving a lot on the table.
Yes, just very briefly, I think 2 points that I'm taking away from this conversation that I particularly appreciated were first, the sort of the reframing of the whole conference here in terms of translation that occurred somewhere midway, which I particularly was interested in. And it sort of reminded me what Robert Kaufman said earlier this week in an event on Paul Celan, where he quoted George Steiner as saying that all poetry, or all the poems Paul Celan ever wrote were actually translated from German, which is a wonderful way to put it, because we know that Celan, the Romanian Ukrainian-born Jew who wrote in German and partly in French, the whole situation is so very interesting. But to think of those German language poem of his as already translations from German is, I think, a very poignant approach to the issues at hand. But then Rob also said that you can always flip this, and you can always say that they're not only translations from German, but also into German of something else, whether it is aesthetic form or political engagement or some other questions and issues. And this brings me to my second point, which I think is the very terms in which this conversation was set up. And I like that. I like the way that, we were like defining the terms. Let's lay the whole toolkit on the table and see what terms we have, what words we have, how we are uneasy with them, whether as scholars or as translators or as presenters of stuff to people out there and common readers and just people, who come into a bookshop and pick a certain book from shelf very randomly and go, well, am I going to read that? What kind of translation is this? Is this Russian or not? Is this Soviet? Which I think is fantastic. And I also think that I like the fact, the sort of the unease that even grew towards the end of the conversation on all the different ends of the spectrum, whether we like those terms as scholars, whether we are comfortable with them as people donning different identities. And I think this is the greatest takeaway possible, just to keep fine-tuning and also opening those things, because otherwise we're just gonna have to wrap it up with formulations such as the Russophone question, which I'm sure brings to mind the horrible formula, which I'm not even going to unpack here. You will all excuse me. And I'm not saying this because I think that we're being glib. We're not. It's the inadequacy of the apparatus that we have to rely on, and it, I think, just points out the fact that there's so much work to be done in the future. Perhaps let's make it a positive conclusion rather than a skeptical one. Thank you.
To respond to Ivan, I think that basically, and to Ainsley, that classification of Russian poetry is pretty much hopeless. It's I struggle with classification of immigrants from the Soviet Union as a psychologist. It needs a multifaceted approach. And also, I will quote my husband, who said he was, Russian dissident artist, who said, if I succeed in America, they will call me an American Russian artist. If I don't succeed, citizens will call me Jewish American artist. And how other people classify you and how they label you has very little to do with reality. Also, where is your audience and who reads you and how they want to see you. So attempts to classify in global and very fluid world arts. Second, artists and poets move from one country to another. If you look at Russian artists, you will barely find a Russian artist who has not now lived in 3 countries, for example. And you'll barely find a Russian artist who is impeccably ethnically Russian and Orthodox. Perhaps Sokov is the only one I could think of. Everybody else is, so to say, Podmochin. They either have Jewish or have Tartar or Armenian or something else. It's hopeless. So I think these attempts to classify also, when I get interviewed, they ask me, do you feel better among American poets or Russian poets? And sometimes I say among American poets because they seem to be more tolerant than Russians. Because, Russians are very sectarian. One group calls the other graphomaniacs and always accused of people not knowing how to write. And when I was interviewed in Globus in Russia by 2 men, and they said, oh, so you write in free verse. So I said, do you mean I can't rhyme? That's why I'm writing in free verse. This is what you imply. So, but I said, I think in contemporary art, people do not question already if Kandinsky or Malevich is an artist. I think, я думаю, что мы давно это уже проехали, But so that kind of hostility among different, groups and sects is inevitable. And for some reason, in Russian culture, it's always present. It's always present no matter what. So I think we have what we have and we have to live with it, right, somehow. But it's very pleasant to see that actually in this meeting, I see people that are quite likable and tolerant and open to discussion, which is not always the case, If you look at contemporary feminist poetry, I just recently got a letter from one editor who said, I'm so happy to see you translating, feminist poets and not translating this particular poet who's no good, and so on and so forth. So it's inevitable that you're going to be labeled by other people, even if you have no intent to that. I want to thank you, everybody here. I think it's a wonderful, open, really interesting discussion.
And I'll just say my thanks again as well to everyone who participated and in the stream as well, posing questions. And now, Zarina, would you like to wrap us up?
Yes, and thank you from the bottom of my heart to everyone, Kevin, for inspiring it, for having the conversation that started this whole worldwide discussion, for every participant, from Ukraine to the Caucasus to Kazakhstan to Finland to Israel, and all those we couldn't include because there were also questions of including Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Belarus. It's just not possible in the frame of, we're already going on 3 hours. So I want to thank also our audience. We had the overwhelming response. I had over 600 people being interested in this topic, which just shows you how rich it is, how much is there to discuss. And I certainly would continue to explore it and offer the platform for everyone, for writers, translators, publishers who want to participate in this discussion and open up the stale definitions to the new and fresh and what literature is. That's how it keeps being alive. We need to have these discussions. And I would like to finish with some humor, because we've been very, very, very serious. And all along as I'm listening, and there's so many thoughts in my head, but all along I keep hearing this Vysotsky's line playing, and I hope it's very prosaic, and I hope people don't mind, because, you know, from Gogol and Bulgakov to Shalom Aleichem and Dovlatov, there's enough humor in Russophone literature, God knows. So Vysotsky's line that keeps playing in my head: распространение наше по планете особенно заметно вдалеке, в общественном парижском туалете есть надписи на русском языке. So in English, our spread over the world is especially noticeable when we are far in the Parisian public restroom. There are inscriptions in Russian language. So rich, so much, so funny, so dirty, so, I mean, difficult to enter. And let's do it, let's explore it, and let's make the best out of it. Thank you so much to everyone. And 3 hours, just stellar. Thank you so much.